The big political story in the UK this week has been a court ruling that a hotel in Epping in Essex called The Bell cannot be used to house asylum seekers as their claims are being processed. On Friday, we learnt that the government is going to appeal that decision. It's going to fight it. We discussed that and some of the other big events of the week on this episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio, which today for one day only is also the 5 Live studio because we're doing this episode of Newscast on 5 Live. Joining us down the line is Alex Forsyth. Hello, Alex.
Hello, Adam.
You're probably on the road to do any questions for Radio 4, aren't you?
Yeah, well, I've actually arrived, so I have been on the road, but I'm currently sat talking to you from outside a village hall in the village of Stegursey in Somerset, where we are doing Any Questions from tonight. Beautiful day to be here, I've got to say.
Have you got any Somerset facts that you will deploy in the intro for any questions?
I can't give too much away now, Adam. Otherwise, no one's going to listen to my fun facts at the top of the programme. But
they're on tenterhooks.
They're on tenterhooks. No, we are not far from Hinkley Point C, which is obviously mid-construction, the big new nuclear power station. So I've been doing a little bit of digging into that, which has proved quite interesting.
Well, and here in the studio with me is Dominic Casciani, Home and Legal Affairs correspondent. Hello, Dom.
Hello.
You've been in a lot of courts this week, haven't you?
Yeah. My bum's hurting from sitting still all day, to be honest.
I was going to ask you, do you have a tactic for like when the judgment is published, and sometimes it's like 80 or 100 pages,
yeah,
and you need to get to the news straight away and find the nuggets. What do you do?
I wing it.
Great. That's slightly too honest answer.
No. There's two things you need to do. The first thing is you need to be really across the story first. So you've got a good understanding of what a judge is likely to rule one way or another, so that when a judge says yay or nay, you know why he or she has said that, because you've got the arguments in your head. Critically as well, judges are quite good these days at structuring their judgments with basically an introduction and finally.
I find them surprisingly easy to read, actually.
Well, I've I'm going to sort of brag a bit here. I've spent a little bit of time behind the scenes, sort of like lobbying judges, as have other reporters.
Really, to make their judging more page-turnery?
Well, I said to one recently, he said to me, how can we make our judgments easier to understand for journalists? And I said, well, write them like a news story. And he thought I was joking.
Yeah. Put the most important bit first.
Yeah.
If you'd like to get involved in this episode of Newscast, which you actually can in real time, because rather than it being recorded and you downloading it, it's live on 5 Live, you can message us on 85058 or WhatsApp us on 08085 909 693, or you can tweet us on X with @5Live as the handle. And also joining us here in the studio is Luke Tryl, who is a pollster for More in Common. Hello, Luke.
Good afternoon.
So I know you've been away on holiday the last few weeks. We won't delve into your holiday snaps, which are available on Insta. But I was just wondering, do you think, and you're a bit of like a political veteran as well from various other jobs, do you think the whole nothing happens in August thing has just gone now? It's been a busy August.
It's over. And I sort of naively said to the team, there'll be nothing to ask the public around over August. Okay, last August was a bit different. There was a new government. And then I got back.
As well, I suppose.
And then I got back. And everything happens over the summer. And I think particularly as well, what's been interesting this summer is Reform UK have clearly realised that it is a good time to try and get news and stuff out there, which is why you've seen them having this sort of regular drumbeat of stories as well. So it's not just there's more happening. I think it's that politicians are learning how to exploit it as well.
Alex, I know you've been on the road, so maybe not like reading your emails while you're driving, but we just had that statement from the Home Office and Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, saying they're going to get involved in the appeal against the court ruling that said the Bell Hotel in Epping couldn't be used for housing asylum seekers. I suppose Yvette Cooper had to do that, didn't she, politically and practically?
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And I'll let Dom do the kind of legalities, because it sounds to me like, from my limited legal knowledge, that it's a kind of 2-step process, that they first have to ask to be a party in the case and then they can actually ask to appeal the judgment. But I do think there was a bit of a sense of inevitability about this for the reasons that you say, because firstly, this judgment, which was an interim judgment, but it said that the people who were currently being housed, asylum seekers in the Bell Hotel in Epping, had to be moved out by the 12th of September. That obviously posed a bit of a practical headache for the government, because not just where it was going to put those people, but then immediately afterwards we had this flurry of councils saying that they were looking really closely at this judgment and are considering what they might do next, i.e. there could be other councils that decide to use the courts to say, we don't want to have hotels in our area that are housing asylum seekers, so therefore what would the government do when it came to accommodating these people? So there was a practical aspect to it as well. And then from the kind of political side, I think what's been interesting is what the government have been saying this morning is that part of this, they think, is that it shouldn't be up to the judiciary, it shouldn't be up to judges and the courts to decide where the government can house asylum seekers. So they're kind of trying to argue it on a democratic mandate as much as anything else. But it's perhaps not surprising that immediately the Conservatives, who were kind of quick out the gates welcoming the court decision, saying it was a victory for local people, are now saying that the government's wrong to challenge it. Of course, under the Conservatives, hotel use reached a peak.
And Dom, just explain why it was that the government of the UK, were basically sort of bystanders in this court case rather than being like right in there in the first place.
Because they didn't take the opportunity to get involved early enough. They were put on notice that this case was being brought by Epping Forest District Council, and they were going for an injunction against the owners, who are called Somani Hotels. And they, for whatever reason, didn't find a barrister in time to get into court. Something along those lines, the suggestion being that most barristers are in the Dordogne this time of year, who can say one way or another. So we had this weird situation this week where a very, very experienced barrister who does a lot of government work, turned up on Tuesday and literally, with effectively the legal equivalent of a begging letter to the judge,
saying, "Please, can we be involved?
Please, can we be involved?" Yeah. So, where we're at now is a slightly weird situation because, the government, obviously from an optics position has decided it wants to be seen as appealing, trying to appeal or challenge, but they're actually at a very early stage. There's no guarantee they're going to get an appeal. It's a bit like, I forgive the crass analogy here, but it's a bit like when you're 6 years old and your mum has said you can't have a biscuit, and you're just going, "Oh, please, can I have a biscuit, please?" But you're not actually entertained.
Doesn't get you any closer to the biscuit.
No, it doesn't. And then the government is kind of in that position at the moment. They've got to get the Court of Appeal to just listen to the basic principles about why they can appeal before they can actually appeal.
Luke, talk about the sort of calculations Yvette Cooper will be making in saying this. Actually, it's sort of the most she can say, but it's not a great deal, is it?
No, it's not at all. And I think, we know that the hotels policy is exceptionally unpopular.
Exceptionally?
With the public.
What does that mean?
A very sort of clear majority against. And what's interesting is that when we asked in 2023, we said, what would you think about asylum seekers being kept in temporary accommodation, such as hotels, in your local area? It was actually basically split. It was just slightly more, maybe 2 points more opposition than support. That has totally shifted, and opposition to that temporary accommodation in people's neighbourhoods has risen by over 20 points over a 2-year period. And that has coincided.
Which in opinion terms is a lot very quickly.
That is a big shift. Public opinion doesn't generally shift that quickly, absent, major developments. But alongside that, what we've seen over the past year is the salience of immigration and asylum issues.
In other words, how much people care about it and notice it as a thing. Yeah.
Exactly. We ask every week, what are your top issues? What are the top issues facing the country? And cost of living is way out ahead, as it has been since the pandemic. But what's happened, basically since the start of this year is you've seen that creep up of immigration and asylum issues. And this week, for the first week, levels of immigration just overtook the NHS for the number 2 spot. So the government's in a real bind here because it's an issue that people care about a lot and think is important, and they're very opposed to the hotels policy. And you can understand why, if you're a local council, you've seen all of these other councils falling to reform, you think, I've got to get on this bandwagon of trying to get the asylum hotels out of my area, and it could all sort of spiral very quickly.
You can see where the incentives are for everyone to just leap on it. Dom, we had an interesting conversation earlier on this week on Newscast when we were kind of digesting the ruling, and it was about actually where these protests outside the Bell Hotel featured in the judge's mind when he made this ruling and said it had to be shut down. Just explain to us to what extent it was about the protests.
Well, it wasn't about the protests directly, for a simple legal reason that the courts will not be swayed by unlawful action, because by definition, then the courts would be taking into account something which is illegal. The courts are about the law, which is actually, just as an aside, Alex has mentioned that the Home Office is a bit cross with judges suggesting there's a democratic problem with this. That will raise a lot of eyebrows among the judiciary and the legal world today, because judges enforce the law, and what happened on Tuesday was about the law. It wasn't about
it's reminiscent of Brexit. Do you remember when the Mail had the front page saying enemies of the people, and then Liz Truss, who was Justice Secretary at the time, got it in the neck for not defending the judges from that front page. So we're actually back in that territory, kind of.
Well, potentially, and we certainly are with some political figures, and there's a lot of concern within the legal world about some of this rhetoric. But let's break down what the judge said. Basically, what the judge said is, if there are lawful protests taking place outside some hotel being used for asylum seekers, crack on. The court is not going to look at that and see that as a lawful reason to intervene and injunct the use of that hotel to accommodate asylum seekers. That's lawful protest. You have to put up with it, whether you like it or not. In a democratic society, it's the price to be paid. If there is unlawful protest, that is not good enough reason either. But this is where it gets a little bit complicated and a little bit nuanced. The council's case was that Somani Hotels, the owners, were acting unlawfully by having moved asylum seekers in, and the unlawful action there is they were breaching their planning controls. Now the hotel owners deny that. And that unlawful action, in turn, had led to other unlawful action, which were the protests, and then the arrival of lots of police and a fear of crime. And all of this amounted to what's called a loss of amenity, or an arguable loss of amenity, which is basically planning talk for the character of the areas changing and becoming less nice.
Right.
And on those specific grounds, the judge said, if the council's got an arguable case that the area is becoming less pleasant, that is a breach potentially of planning law, and therefore I'm going to temporarily lob this injunction in until we can resolve whether or not the hotel is acting lawfully or not. So the protests kind of coming in directly.
But Alex, it just shows you that when it comes to immigration, asylum, the housing of asylum seekers, it's a bit like whack-a-mole for the government, isn't it? Like they do one initiative, like doing the quite innovative deal with France, the one in, one out deal, which means that if people come over the channel, they can get deported back to France, and in return, somebody will be brought over legitimately and legally. That was quite hard for them to get in place, and they were quite pleased with it when they did. But yet then this pops up over there.
Yeah, I think that's completely right. And I think that is why the government makes this case that when it comes to this whole issue of people crossing the channel on small boats and where they then go, they completely acknowledge and actually claim there is no one thing that's going to fix this. And their hope is that there's a whole range of measures that they are doing. So it's like that one in, one out deal with France, which at the moment is just a pilot scheme. The initial numbers are expected to be quite small, but they're hopeful that will ultimately be a deterrent. The stuff they're doing about toughening the criminal regime and the way that they can approach some of the smuggling gangs, they hope eventually all of this is going to come together and start to bring those numbers of small boat crossings down, and then subsequently the use of hotels down. But I think the kind of problem for them is that these two issues in particular, so the small boat crossings and the use of hotels, they've become just these really visible, tangible focal points for public frustration about this issue. And with the hotel use, for example, I mean, the government's position is that it wants to end the use of hotels. But what Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, is saying today about this judgment is that she thinks that it needs to be done in an orderly fashion, i.e. she doesn't want it just to be the case that the courts say you can't have people here and then the government's stuck with where do they go. But the bit behind that is that where do they go? Because when there have been alternatives considered. So, for example, when the previous administration was looking at disused military bases, or do you remember the barge, the Bibi Stockholm, and that there were some people housed on the barge, that attracted an awful lot of local opposition as well. And when you look at other alternatives, so it might be private rental sector or houses of multiple occupation, in local areas, yes, they can become points of tension or points of concern. But there's also the bigger problem that there is just a real strain when it comes to housing. And there are lots of people on housing waiting lists, and local authorities are already really struggling to find accommodation for families. So, you know, I think the kind of what we have referred to as a political headache for the government about all of this, because they are under such significant political pressure, it is a really big practical challenge as well. And I think that is why we have seen ministers out this week in the wake of that judgment about the Bell Hotel in Epping being, you know, not being able to say, well, what are the alternatives? It's kind of like they're very hopeful. And I mean, they would say, if you speak to people in government, they say they're pretty sure, but there is undoubtedly an element of hope that eventually all of the different things they're doing are going to start to have an impact.
We had a message from Bill who says, please can you tell us how many hotel beds are being occupied by asylum seekers? That's a more reliable figure, he says, than the number of hotels. Renting 200 hotels sounds better than 400, which is what it was before, but not if the number of hotel occupants has gone up. And Dom, I happen to have the number in front of me right now because the Home Office released it yesterday. It's 32,059 people in hotels, and that's 200-ish hotels.
That's right, and 300 fewer than in March.
But that's more than at the time of the election.
And lower than the peak, which was 56,000.
So it's gone down and then up, then down, and it's going down, but or it's staying flat.
Yeah. Look,
or something.
I mean,
don't do graphs in a podcast as well.
Don't do graphs in a podcast. Yeah, but I mean, look, a lot of this is about what's happening with the backlog. It's not just about arrivals. So if you think about it, you have cases coming into the asylum system. They have to be processed. Only so many can be processed in one go. So you inevitably get a bit of a backlog at any given time. The backlog got bigger and bigger after 2018 because of policy changes in the Home Office, then the pandemic, then a rush of arrivals when the pandemic ended. And then critically, decisions the Conservatives took not to process cases in the hope of sending people to Rwanda.
Yeah.
That led to an enormous backlog. Labour came in and said, right, we're going to deal with this, because they know they've got to deal with that, because only by getting the backlog down and processing people either through to settlements as genuine refugees or basically saying they have to be removed because they haven't got a case. Until that happens, you have to put these people somewhere, and they've run out of housing, so you put them in hotels. The big problem, though, Adam, now is that the backlog is coming down, so that's progress by the Home Office because they're taking decisions faster, but there's a new backlog in the appeal courts. 50-odd thousand cases there, people saying, hang on a second. So until the appeal courts deal with that, you're not going to see the hotels come down.
Bob has messaged us from Knighton saying, living in a hotel is far from ideal for anybody. People would be better housed in the community where possible. And if local residents were encouraged to open their homes to a refugee, it happened for Ukrainians, didn't it? There might be less room for misunderstandings. Bob, with a very optimistic view of human nature there, based on what people are then saying about the alternatives of housing people in like houses.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting that when you look at the Homes for Ukraine scheme, actually continues to command massive public support, and that was over 100,000 people that came to the country. So it's not quite as simple as people oppose refugees, people oppose asylum. There is something specific about channel crossings, which is it's seen as, well, we don't know who's coming in, we've got no way of vetting it. And also
backdoor,
but it's also breaking the rules. And people will say in focus groups, how do we know they're the people most in need, even whilst, they express sympathy or empathy for people crossing. But the interesting thing about Homes for Ukraine was not only that people understood the conflict, they could see there was genuine need. It did something else. It put communities in control, because rather than it being government saying, I'm going to, put people in this hotel in your area, it was people coming forward and saying that's what we want. And actually a lot of this debate comes down to community and control. It's not just that people are worried about levels of immigration. They are, but it's the way in which the policy is delivered. And when we've tested community sponsorship to that exact point from the message there. It actually significantly reduces opposition to asylum if it's a scheme where it's local people saying we want it rather than it being imposed.
Interesting. Right, now for something completely different. Alex, when you were driving to Somerset today, did you see more St George's flags or Union Jacks than you might normally expect?
Well,
or maybe you weren't measuring it because you didn't know I was going to ask.
and I was on the train.
Oh, right. Well, I always think of you in the car.
Yeah, no, I often am in the car, but today I was on a really busy train. I just warn you, if you're going from London to the southwest on a bank holiday weekend, bag yourself a seat early if you can. Because
and also, please do not try and hang up a flag by a railway line. That is not safe.
Do you not have some kind of any questions branded car?
Oh yes, I have my own personal fleet of. No, I don't know. We do public transport wherever we possibly can.
Anyway,
but so I didn't really have the chance. But I totally take your point that this is something that is happening in lots of communities, right? A social media trend, but lots of flags popping up all over the place.
And this all started because there's this campaign group called Operation Raise the Colours. Although actually saying campaign group, it's more just some people on Facebook and sending messages to their mates saying, let's put up all these flags. And they've started raising money. They're doing some crowdfunding. And this phenomenon is kind of spreading all over the place. And then you get the backlash to it. For example, Tower Hamlets Council saying, hang on, lampposts aren't public property. They're council property. You're technically vandalising our stuff. And the flags get taken down. And that then creates some tension. Luke, as somebody who looks the British public in the eye every day, what do you think is behind this phenomenon? Is it more than just a really popular Facebook group?
Well, look, I think it is, and I think we might have spoken about this before on the very good Antisocial podcast.
One of my other side hustles, this time on Radio 4.
There is no doubt that flag wars have become a feature of our politics. Earlier in the summer, we were talking about reform councils and their battles to stop, official buildings flying the Pride Progress flag or even the Ukrainian flag. You've now got the flip side of that is where should you be displaying the Union Jack or the St George's Cross? And look, most Brits, they like seeing the St George's Cross. They like seeing the Union Jack. They want us to be proud of who we are as a country. We haven't polled on this yet. We will be doing. I suspect, though, that the median member of the public is a little bit eye-rolly about this slightly, we must have them on every lamppost and we must have them everywhere. You know, as Brits want to celebrate the flag, particularly during national events or when the football is on. I'm not sure this approach of trying to hang them from everything that is basically a pole is going to work.
And polling of a different kind, rather than the ones you're used to. Alex, and of course, Robert Jenrick, the Shadow Justice Secretary, loves. Some people might say he loves a passing bandwagon, but he's posted on social media that hoisting a flag proudly himself. Although I noticed he went for a Union Jack, not an England flag. So he obviously wants to be one nation rather than England.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I just think there is something utterly fascinating at the moment with this thing that's going on social media when you have just politicians trying to almost be the quickest off the mark or keen to kind of outdo each other when they can quite literally attach their flag to whatever cause it is that they think is going to get them some public support. I mean, I guess you could argue that politicians have always done that, right? You know, they rely on public support to get them to where they want to be. But I think there is something that's going on at the moment, and this is absolutely not limited to Robert Jenrick. But if you just, as I do, keep half an eye on that political social media, and it is social media video post battle for who can get there first to back whatever the thing is that they think is going to prove popular. It's quite extraordinary.
Dom?
I think there's a lesson from history here, from Northern Ireland, not in terms of paramilitaries, I stress that at the outset. But I used to work in Northern Ireland on and off in the early days of my career for the BBC, and I have a lot of love for the place and the people there. But one of the things you notice when you first go in as what BBC Belfast used to call blow-ins, people like me who come from London, is you notice the painted flagstones, the pavers, the curbstones, red, white and blue in unionist areas, and then the Irish tricolour in nationalist areas. And And that is very much linked to a sense of really trying to articulate national identity. And very often it's also linked to a sense of uncertainty about what national identity is in politically uncertain times.
It's a sign of insecurity, yeah.
It can be for some people. It's a sign of pride as well. But it really strikes you when you first go there because you think, why do these people need to do this? I don't see this on the streets of Nottingham or Leeds or wherever else at home. And I've been very struck this week to see flags being used in a context of trying to project something.
And also people need to be careful what they wish for, because the times I've been to Northern Ireland at election times, every lamppost is covered in pictures of candidates.
Yeah.
And so what starts with flags can become pictures of politicians, and I'm not sure people want their mugs all over the place.
I think that anxiety point is a really key one. We did some research earlier this summer, which basically found that one of the big fault lines now in British politics is whether you think British identity is disappearing nowadays or whether you think it's been strengthened through diversity. And I think this, the appearance of people putting up the flags everywhere is an expression of that anxiety of people saying, if we don't do something, British identity is going to disappear. And then on the other side, you've got people saying, well, British identity is about diversity and that the flag is important, but there are lots of other things as well. And I think we're seeing that play out now in real time.
Yeah, and Alex, classic newscast, I wanted to ask you loads of stuff about all this speculation about what's going to be in the budget, because every day there's a new story. But in classic newscast lore, we've talked about one thing for too long because we've got too into it, because everything is interesting when you look at it in enough depth. So we'll say that for another episode of Newscast.
Do you know what? I just say, I don't think there's going to be any shortage of opportunity for us to speculate about what might or not be in the budget ahead of November. To be perfectly honest, there's going to be plenty of chat about that.
Alex, enjoy any questions?
Thank you.
Dominic, thanks for your analysis all week.
Thank you very much.
And Luke, thanks for coming in as well.
Thanks for having me.